The attorney's hands were shaking so badly that the red wax seal almost slipped from his fingers before it broke. It was June 17th, 1854, and the parlor at Belmont Manor in Natchez, Mississippi, had never been this quiet. The summer heat pressed against the tall windows, the curtains barely stirring as 15 people sat rigidly in their chairs, all eyes fixed on the man holding the folded document that was about to destroy their idea of what their lives were. James Whitfield, attorney and longtime legal advisor to the Thornton family, cleared his throat once, then again, as if buying himself a few more seconds before he unleashed what was written on those pages. He knew what was coming. Beaten dot in the center of the room sat Margaret Thornton, draped in heavy black mourning silk, the fabric swallowing her narrow frame and making her look smaller than she really was. Only her face betrayed the strain, pale, composed, and determined not to crack in front of witnesses. She had buried her husband of 23 years just 3 days earlier, and now she was presiding over what she believed would be the orderly transfer of one of Mississippi's largest cotton fortunes to herself and her children. Around her sat Robert and Margaret's 4 children, Robert Jr., 22, already imagining himself master of Belmont. William, 18, restless and uncertain. Elizabeth and Anne, both in their 20s, unmarried but secure enough in their dowries to know their futures were protected. On the other side of the room sat Margaret's sister, Carolyn, her brother-in-law, Thomas Thornton, 2 family attorneys, and several prominent Natchez witnesses brought in to ensure propriety. Everyone believed they knew exactly how the afternoon would go. A will, a reading, a few formal signatures, the quiet confirmation of what society already assumed, that wealth, land, and power would pass from one white man to his white heirs without interruption. None of them understood that in a matter of minutes, the world they thought was solid would fall straight through the floorboards. Whitfield began with the usual formalities, his voice steady at first. The standard legal language rolled through the air: sound mind, last will, and testament, revocation of previous documents. Margaret's posture softened by a fraction. This was familiar territory. Her oldest son leaned back, already calculating improvements to the plantation, expansion of the cotton operation, perhaps the purchase of additional land. Elizabeth and Anne traded the kind of small, relieved smiles that said, "It's over, we're safe." Ben Whitfield's tone shifted. He had reached the first bequest. "To my wife, Margaret Elizabeth Thornton, I leave the sum of $1 to be paid within 30 days of my death." For a second, no one moved. The word "one" hung in the air like a misfired shot. Margaret's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Then she managed, "There must be some mistake." Her voice stumbled over the words, halfway between command and disbelief. "James, check the document again." Robert would never. Whitfield didn't look at her. His eyes remained on the paper. "Mrs. Thornton, if you'll allow me to continue." His hand trembled noticeably now. "To my sons, Robert James Thornton, Jr., and William Charles Thornton, I leave the sum of $1 each, to be paid within 30 days of my death." The air in the room changed thick, electric, dangerous. Robert Jr. jerked forward in his chair. "This is insane," he snapped. "My father had over $400,000 in assets. The plantation alone is worth—" "Please sit down, Mr. Thornton," Whitfield said, his voice tight. "I must read the document in full." He pressed on before anyone could interrupt. "To my daughters Elizabeth Margaret Thornton and Anne Carolyn Thornton, I leave the sum of $1 each, to be paid within 30 days of my death." The quiet that followed wasn't silence. It was something worse. It was the crushing stillness that comes just before the storm breaks, when everyone in the room realizes at the same time that the life they assumed was guaranteed has just been erased with a few carefully written sentences. Elizabeth began to cry, her shoulders shaking as she tried to smother the sound. Anne stared straight ahead, her face drained of expression, as if her mind had simply stepped out of her body and refused to come back. William looked like he might vomit. Whitfield swallowed hard. "I must now read the primary bequest." His voice cracked slightly on the word primary. No one spoke. Even the house seemed to be holding its breath. Somewhere, muffled, a clock ticked in the hallway. Outside, a cicada buzzed. Inside, everything was suspended on the edge of the next sentence. To Eliza Marie, Whitfield read. And his voice faltered on the name. A woman of approximately 32 years of age. Currently held as property at Belmont Manor. I hereby grant immediate and unconditional freedom. Someone gasped aloud. Margaret made a hoarse, strangled sound, half sob, half denial. But Whitfield was not finished. Furthermore, I grant to the aforementioned Eliza Marie the entirety of Belmont Plantation, including all 3,100 acres of land, all buildings, all equipment, all livestock, and all crop yields, current and future. A noise rippled through the assembled witnesses, the sharp intake of breath, the shocked whisper, the half-formed protest. The temperature in the room seemed to spike, then drop. Whitfield continued, each word swinging like a hammer against the structure of their world. I further grant to Eliza Marie my full ownership stake in Thornton Cotton Factoring Company, my shares in the Natchez Railroad Company, my property holdings in Natchez City proper, including the house at 42 Pearl Street, all bank deposits, all bonds, all securities, all personal property of every kind and description, and all currency in any form. Chairs creaked as people shifted, stunned. A banker in the corner muttered something under his breath and was immediately shushed by his wife. Carolyn Thornton's hand flew to her mouth. Thomas Thornton went very still, eyes narrowing, mind already racing ahead to legal strategy. Margaret lurched to her feet so quickly that her chair crashed backward onto the polished floor. No, she said, her voice raw, rising. No, this is forgery. This is madness. She pointed a shaking finger at Whitfield. You wrote this? You and that woman. You're trying to steal my husband's estate. Mrs. Thornton, Whitfield said, his face ashen. Your husband came to my office 6 weeks before his death and dictated this will to me personally. I advised him strongly against these provisions. He insisted. I wrote exactly what he ordered. 6 weeks. Margaret's voice rose into a shrill, almost hysterical pitch. 6 weeks he sat in this house, at my table, under my roof, and he had already written us out of everything. 6 weeks he let me plan his recovery, his future. And all the while, her words dissolved into broken fragments. Elizabeth began sobbing openly. Now, William stared down at the rug as if hoping it would swallow him. Robert Jr.'s face had turned a violent shade of red, the veins in his neck standing out. His voice, when it came, was low and dangerous. Who? He asked, each word clipped. Is Eliza Marie? But that, of course, was the question everyone already knew the answer to and had spent years pretending not to. Every person in that room knew exactly who Eliza Marie was. They had simply agreed, silently, never to speak of what she truly represented. Whitfield drew a shaky breath. I am not yet finished. There's one more clause. He read on, his hands trembling so violently now that the paper rattled audibly. I further declare that the following children, currently living at Belmont Manor, are my natural offspring and are to be freed immediately upon my death and provided for from the estate. Marcus, age 9. Sarah, age 6. And Thomas, age 3. The room erupted. Robert Jr. surged to his feet, shouting incoherently, fury spilling over into fragments of accusations. Elizabeth collapsed sideways against Carolyn, who clutched her like someone trying to hold back a flood with bare hands. William cursed it under his breath, his voice cracking. Anne stared at her lap, unblinking, as if her mind had split off from her body, but the reaction wasn't just about names and ages. It was about recognition. Everyone in that room had seen those children 100 times in passing. The small boy with the too familiar eyes. The little girl with the Thornton cheekbones. The toddler whose profile looked disturbingly like Robert Jr.'s baby portraits. They had all seen, all noticed, all chosen not to understand. Those children had always existed in the blurred space between awareness and denial. Whitfield's reading had just dragged them, by name and age, into the harsh light of acknowledgement. Margaret stood frozen, her face twisted with shock and something deeper betrayal, humiliation, the horror of every suspicion she'd forced herself not to articulate. Carolyn whispered harshly, "Margaret, did you know? Did you know about the children?" But Margaret didn't answer. She was staring straight ahead at nothing, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps, as if the air itself had turned poisonous. Whitfield lowered the document. "There are no further provisions," he said quietly. "This is the complete and signed will of Robert James Thornton." For a moment, no one spoke. The entire room seemed suspended between the old world and the new one opening under their feet. Then Margaret's voice cut through the thick silence, cold and deadly. "Where is she?" she asked. "Where is this woman who has stolen my life?" "Mrs. Thornton," Whitfield began, "Miss Eliza is not responsible for—" "Do not?" Margaret snapped, the words sharp as glass. "Call her Miss. She was property. This is my house, my family, my husband's legacy. And I will see her with my own eyes while you explain how a woman who belonged to us yesterday owns everything today." A voice came from the doorway, quiet but unmistakably steady. "I'm right here." Every head in the room turned. In the wide parlor entrance stood a woman in a simple gray dress, its plainness making her presence even more striking. Her posture was straight, her hands folded calmly in front of her, her expression carefully controlled. Eliza Marie was 32 years old, though she had never known the exact date of her birth. Her skin was the warm shade of aged honey, her hair pulled tightly back, revealing a face defined by high cheekbones and amber-colored eyes that missed nothing. She had been born enslaved on a Virginia plantation, sold south at 14. Purchased by Robert Thornton in 1843 under the harmless label of household management. For 11 years she had lived in a cramped room behind the kitchen at Belmont, unseen and indispensable, running accounts, supervising servants, raising 3 children in the shadows of a house that pretended not to know who they were. Now, according to the words on the paper in Whitfield's shaking hand, she owned the house whose threshold she was standing in. For a long moment, no one spoke. Margaret stared at Eliza as if seeing her for the first time. Not as a servant who drifted through the edges of her vision, but as a rival, an accusation, a living indictment of every compromise and silence Margaret had chosen to survive. Something raw and terrible passed between the two women. 11 years of coexistence, layered with unspoken knowledge and unacknowledged pain. They had shared the same roof, the same man, the same corridors, the same lies. One had worn silk and diamonds. The other had carried ledgers and secrets. Both had built their identities on a structure that Robert's final act had just set on fire. "You knew?" Margaret whispered, the words scraping out of her throat. "You knew he was going to do this." Eliza's face remained composed, but her voice was steady, and there was nothing servile in it. "He told me 3 days before he died." Margaret laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. 3 days? He gave you 3 days warning, and me none at all? 11 years you've lived in my house. 11 years I have fed you, clothed you, allowed you to stay under my roof. And this is how you repay me? Eliza's gaze did not drop. "You never gave me anything, Mrs. Thornton," she said quietly. "Your husband purchased me. Every moment of my life here belonged to him. To you, I couldn't refuse him. I couldn't leave. I couldn't protect myself or my children. I wasn't repaying a debt because I never owed you one. I was property." The word landed in the room like a physical blow. Property. It stripped away every polite euphemism. Girl, servant, house help, and left only the brutal reality everyone had been pretending was something else. Robert Jr. took a step toward Eliza, rage twisting his features. The way he moved made Whitfield instinctively shift between them. "Mr. Thornton," the attorney said sharply, "I must advise you against any physical intimidation of Miss Eliza. She is—" "Miss?" Robert Jr. spat. "You call her Miss?" She's she's a free woman as of 3 days ago, Whitfield cut in firmly. By the terms of your father's will and the legal activation of that document upon his death. She is standing in this court and in this county, and as of this moment, she is one of the wealthiest property owners in Adams County. A nervous, almost hysterical laugh burst from one of the witnesses, a banker named Pritchard. It rose too high, too sharp, like someone laughing at their own execution. His wife gripped his arm and pulled him from the room, her face set in a mask of rigid horror. Margaret remained standing amid the chaos, her entire body trembling, her eyes locked on Eliza. When she spoke, her voice was no longer shrill. "It was cold. Why?" she said, almost to herself at first, then louder. "Why? I need to understand. What did you do to him? What did you do to make him choose you over his own blood?" And for the first time in 11 years, Eliza allowed something other than careful neutrality to show on her face. Pain. A deep, old pain that had been pressed into her bones over more than a decade of being owned by the man Margaret was grieving. "I didn't make him choose anything," she said quietly. "Mr. Thornton made his choices every day. He chose to come to my room. He chose to father children he knew would be born enslaved. He chose to keep us all trapped in a lie that protected him and destroyed everyone else. And at the end, when he knew he was dying and couldn't lie to himself anymore, he chose to tell the truth. I'm sorry that truth hurts you, Mrs. Thornton, but you're asking the wrong person why." It was the longest speech Eliza had ever made in front of Margaret. It was also the moment when all the careful performances, dutiful wife, obedient servant, respectable master collapsed at once. The room was no longer simply a parlor in a Mississippi plantation house. It had become a battlefield. And though no one had drawn a weapon, everyone present knew they were standing at the edge of a war that would not end quickly and would not end kindly. The battle for Belmont Manor had just begun. The hours after the will reading would later be described by the household servants as the closest thing to war they had ever seen without the sound of gunfire. The parlor emptied slowly, not because anyone wanted to leave, but because no one knew what to do next. People drifted out in stunned clusters, whispering over their shoulders, glancing back at Eliza like she was a dangerous apparition, something that had stepped out of a story and refused to go back in. Margaret did not retreat to the privacy of her room in dignified silence, as a proper widow might have done. She stood rooted to the spot until everyone but her children and immediate family had gone, as if moving would somehow make what she had heard more real. Finally, Carolyn and Thomas each took an arm and guided her out of the room, her steps stiff, her face drained of expression. The illusion that Belmont Manor was a stable, orderly household had been shattered in a single afternoon. But the roles its inhabitants played were not going to disappear overnight. Margaret Thornton had just discovered she had been written out of her husband's wealth. She had not yet accepted being written out of her own home, upstairs, in the master bedroom she had shared with Robert for 23 years. Margaret stripped off her black hat and veil with shaking hands and let them fall onto the floor. She did not bother with careful placement or propriety. The room still smelled faintly of Robert's cologne and the camphor the doctor used in his final weeks. His hairbrush sat on the dresser. His boots were in the corner. His walking cane leaned against the bedpost, as if he might come in at any moment to retrieve it. Margaret stared at these objects with a fury that bordered on madness. She called her children into the room. Robert Jr., Elizabeth, Anne, and William filed in and stood in a ragged line at the foot of the bed. Every one of them pale, shaken, and searching their mother's face for some sign that this would all be fixed, that she would make it right, that the world would return to something they recognized. She didn't comfort them. She gave them a vow Elizabeth would later testify about that night in court, her voice trembling as she described how her mother, still in mourning black, standing in the bedroom where Robert's body had lain, made them swear an oath. "We will not accept this," Margaret said, her voice low and fierce. "We will not be robbed of what is ours by a woman who was our property yesterday and is our enemy today. Your father was ill. He was manipulated, poisoned in mind and spirit. We will prove that this will is an abomination. We will expose her for what she is. We will use every legal weapon we possess. We will take back what belongs to us, even if it takes the rest of our lives." She made each of them say it out loud, Robert Jr., with clenched teeth, William with a wavering voice, Anne in a whisper, Elizabeth in choked, tearful agreement. In that room, in that moment, Margaret's grief hardened into purpose. She would not be the widow quietly displaced by a freedwoman. She would be the general of a long campaign. While Margaret was turning her children into soldiers upstairs, another scene unfolded in the cramped room behind the kitchen where Eliza had lived for 11 years. The space was barely large enough for a narrow bed, a small table, and a wooden chest. Yet it had been the center of her world, the place where she did her private work, where she taught herself to breathe quietly enough not to draw attention, where she raised her children in the shadow of a house that refused to acknowledge them. Now those children were pressed against her, clinging to her skirts as if she were the only solid object left in a collapsing universe. Marcus, at 9, had heard enough in the parlor to understand that something enormous had happened. He knew his father was dead. He knew there was a document that changed their fate. He knew his mother's name had been spoken in front of white people in a way that made them angry and afraid. Sarah, 6, had only felt the tension, the shouting, the way the white lady's voice had turned sharp and wild. "Mama," she whispered, eyes wide, "why was the white lady screaming at you?" Thomas, 3, had cried himself to exhaustion, and now slept with his head in Eliza's lap. His small hand fisted in the fabric of her dress, as if even in sleep he knew. He could not afford to let go. Marcus's voice broke the fragile quiet. "Are we really free?" he asked, the word free landing in the air like something too big for his mouth. A word he knew from whispers, from stories, from rumor, but not from experience. Eliza stroked his hair, the soft reddish-brown curls that came from his father's side. The color that had always made it impossible to pretend he was anyone's child but Robert's. She thought about how to answer. The document said they were free. The attorney had said the words out loud in front of witnesses. But what did freedom mean in a world where every road, every law, every custom said they were still less than human? What did it mean to be free on paper in a town where no white merchant would sell to you? Where the law saw you as a problem to be contained? Where your existence frightened people because it reminded them of everything they did not want to confront? "It means," she said slowly, choosing the only true thing she could offer him, "that we are going to fight to stay together, no matter what happens next." It was not the answer he wanted, but it was the only one that did not feel like a lie. Because Eliza knew something Marcus did not yet fully understand. The will had not resolved anything. It had detonated something that would take years to settle, and in that time, the danger to her family would be constant. The white world would not accept what Robert had done without a fight. The question was not whether there would be a battle, it was how far the people who felt threatened would go to win. The story of how they had all arrived at this moment was woven through 11 years. Decisions, silences, and compromises. Robert Thornton had not purchased Eliza by accident. In 1843, a Virginia planter passing through Natchez had quietly arranged a private sale. Among the inventory of assets listed in his papers, one entry stood out, Eliza. Age approximately 21, household trained, literate. Excellent with figures. Literacy in an enslaved woman made her dangerous and valuable. It meant she could read letters, account books, contracts. It meant she could learn more than she was ever meant to know. Most owners tried to stamp out such skills. But when Robert met Eliza briefly at a prior sale and saw the way she spoke, the way she absorbed information, the way she carried herself, something sparked in him that he would spend the next decade alternately indulging and loathing. He paid $2,000 for her, nearly double the going rate. Margaret had been furious. $2,000 could have purchased 3 or 4 field hands, or expanded their acreage, or serviced debts. Why do we need another house servant? She had demanded, slamming her diary shut after recording the transaction. "We have 6 already?" We have girls to serve a table, to sew, to clean, to tend to the children. Why this one? Why at that price? Robert's answer, recorded in Margaret's own hand, had been smooth and practical. She can manage the household accounts, he'd said. You're always saying you need help with the books. You dislike figures. She doesn't think of the burden it will remove from you. And Margaret, who had never liked the ledgers, who saw numbers as something that lived in her husband's world, not hers, had grudgingly accepted the explanation. Telling herself that delegating such tedious work was a concession she was entitled to as mistress of a large estate, Eliza stepped into Belmont as property and became indispensable within months. She reorganized the account books that Margaret had let drift into chaos. She tracked every expenditure, every credit, every shipment of cotton bales down the river. She caught errors that had been costing the plantation hundreds of dollars, then thousands. She mastered the rhythms of planting, harvest, shipping, and sale, not as a planter, but as a mind trained to see patterns. Robert began bringing her more than just receipts. He brought her decisions. Should he invest in the new Natchez Railroad Company? Should he hedge against fluctuations in cotton prices? Should he sell a parcel of marginal land or hold it? He would bring the questions. She would bring the numbers. Margaret noticed, of course, but she told herself it was fine. It was just business. Eliza was a tool, a bright, unusually skilled tool, but a tool nonetheless. The line between business and something else blurred gradually, as such lines often do. By early 1845, Eliza was pregnant. No one in the house needed to ask who the father was. The plantation midwife, an older enslaved woman everyone called Aunt Bessie, would later testify that the baby came into the world with Mr. Roberts' nose and jaw so clearly stamped on his face that it seemed God was mocking the idea of secrecy. When Margaret visited the birthing room, she stood at the doorway, looked at Eliza on the bed, the newborn in her arms, and then turned on her heel and walked away without a word. For the next 3 months, she acted as if Marcus did not exist. No questions, no acknowledgments, no discussion. It was an act of denial so complete that even the other servants found it uncanny. Margaret's world depended on the belief that a proper wife could ignore her husband's indiscretions so thoroughly that they became irrelevant. Marcus's mere existence made that belief impossible. So she chose not to see him at all. Robert, however, could not pretend. Not entirely. He did not stand in church and claim the child or revise the family Bible to include him. The rules of his society would not allow that. But he made small decisions that carried the weight of confessed guilt. He had Eliza's cramped room improved better windows, slightly more space. He ensured that Marcus was never assigned field labor, always kept close to the house. He brought books to Eliza's room, children's primers, readers, arithmetic texts. He taught Marcus to recognize letters, to sound them out, to add and subtract, just as he taught his legitimate son upstairs. He knew full well that he was teaching an enslaved child skills that many states tried hard to suppress. It was a quiet rebellion, or perhaps just a way to soothe his conscience without changing anything fundamental. By 1848, another child had arrived, Sarah, delicate, sharp-eyed. In 1850, Thomas followed. 3 children in 6 years, all unmistakably his dot through all of this. Margaret maintained her silence. She never confronted Eliza. She confronted Robert only once, after Marcus's birth, and his response had been brutally simple. "My relations with the household staff are not your concern," he had said, according to Margaret's later letters. "You are my wife." He managed the house in public. "I will manage my affairs in private." That was the end of it, at least outwardly. Margaret might rage in ink to her sister, might cry behind a locked door, but in public she remained the perfect planter's wife. She smiled at church. She hosted dinners. She supervised the white children's upbringing. She refused to give society the satisfaction of seeing her crack. Years later, in the midst of the court battle that would define all of their lives, Margaret wrote to her sister Caroline, trying to explain why she had never left, why she had accepted a marriage that had become nothing more than an arrangement. What was I supposed to do? She wrote, "Leave him and go where? My father's estate was entailed to my brothers. I had no independent income. I had 4 children to protect. If I had made a scandal, accused Robert openly, I would have been the one punished, not him. Men are granted their indiscretions. Everyone knows it. A wife's duty is to look away, to maintain the appearance of peace. I played my role as I was expected to. I kept the house. I raised the legitimate children. I protected our name. And this is how I am rewarded." The words dripped with bitterness. But hidden beneath the anger was another truth she never fully admitted to herself. Robert had stopped touching her in 1844. The intimacy of their marriage had ended long before his affair with Eliza became undeniable. They shared a roof, a name, a social role, but not a life. So when Robert walked into Whitfield's office 6 weeks before his death and dictated a will that made Eliza and their children the primary heirs, he was not just redistributing property. He was finally admitting out loud and in ink where his emotional life had been living for over a decade. The will wasn't just a legal document. It was a confession, a map of the past 11 years that showed how completely his loyalties had shifted. Even as he'd maintained the facade of a proper planter family, within days of the reading, Thomas Thornton moved from shock to strategy. He was Robert's younger brother, a lawyer, a man who understood how power actually functioned behind the polite language of law. He knew at once that they couldn't simply rage about injustice. They had to attack the will itself. On June 24th, 1854, exactly a week after the parlor explosion, he filed a petition in Adams County Chancery Court. The document was carefully constructed, a weapon cloaked in legal phrasing. First, he argued that Robert had not been of sound mind when he made the will. The doctors had called his illness consumption of the lungs, but everyone knew what that meant, the slow, wasting agony of tuberculosis. Thomas claimed the fever, the pain, the fear of death had unbalanced his brother's judgment. Second, he alleged undue influence. Eliza had held an unusually close position in Robert's household, handling accounts. Managing the house, bearing his children, she had, in Thomas's version, used her proximity and her body to manipulate a dying man into destroying his own legitimate family. Third, and perhaps most powerfully, he argued that the will simply could not stand under Mississippi law. Even if Robert had the right to free Eliza, he did not have the right, Thomas claimed, to make her one of the largest property owners in the county. The laws restricting free people of color might be ambiguous in their wording, but their intent was clear. Someone like Eliza was never meant to hold that much power. Word of the petition spread quickly. Eliza heard about it when Whitfield came to see her in a small office in downtown Natchez, a place she would never have entered as a client under any other circumstances. He arrived with more than just the petition. He carried a second sealed document, the one Robert had instructed him to open only if the will was challenged. When Whitfield broke that wax seal and began to read Robert's letter aloud, Eliza realized that whatever she thought she knew about Robert's inner life was only a fraction of the truth he had kept to himself. The letter was not public testimony. It was not for Margaret nor for society. It was a man talking to the one person he had trusted to carry out his final act in that letter. Robert admitted what everyone else was trying to twist into something more flattering or more monstrous, depending on their side. He acknowledged that he had purchased Eliza with calculation, intending to use her talents for his financial advantage. He admitted that what began as exploitation had turned into something he called love, even as he questioned whether love could exist between owner and owned. He confessed that he had kept his legitimate marriage alive in appearance only while building a secret family in the shadows. And he acknowledged, with a kind of desperate clarity, that he had built his wealth and his children's lives on stolen labor, stolen bodies, and stolen years. "This will," he wrote, "is not generosity. It is inadequate restitution. I stole 11 years of her life and my children's freedom. I cannot give back what I took. I can only try, in this one small, insufficient way, to admit what I've done and change a fraction of what I can before I die. When Whitfield finished reading, Eliza sat in silence for a long time, the words settling into her like stones. Robert had never spoken to her like that while he was alive. He had never used the word theft in relation to her, never named what their relationship actually was beneath all the lonely nights and soft words. Men, Whitfield said quietly, often found courage on paper that they never managed in life. The letter gave Eliza something she had never had before, written proof that Robert understood exactly what he had done to her and to their children. It also gave her something else, a choice. Whitfield told her plainly what using the letter would mean. It would expose every detail of her life with Robert. It would give Thomas and Margaret's allies material to twist, to slander, to turn into a story about an ambitious, enslaved woman who seduced her master and destroyed his family for profit. They will say terrible things about you, Whitfield warned. In open court, in newspapers, in whispers that never end. Are you prepared for that? Eliza thought of Marcus, of Sarah, of little Thomas. She thought of the future they might have if she won, even a partial victory, and the life they would face if she surrendered. Returning to a world where their bodies and labor belonged to someone else. She thought of every insult already thrown at her behind closed doors, of every look she had endured, of the way white women's eyes had skimmed past her like she was furniture, not flesh. I have been called terrible things my entire life, she said finally. What is a few more words compared to my children's freedom? It was a courageous answer, but she had no idea how far her opponents would go or how long the fight would last. She had no way of knowing that the war that began in that parlor would stretch on for 7 grinding years, dragging every secret, every compromise, every ugly truth about Belmont Manor and its people into the light by the time the first hearing date was set for August 1854. The house itself had split into invisible camps. The White family ate and slept in the main rooms as they always had. But the atmosphere had changed, thicker, more brittle, every glance sharpened. Margaret was still the lady of the house in practice, even if the paper in Whitfield's desk said otherwise. She refused to leave, refused to acknowledge that the ground beneath her had shifted. Eliza, technically the legal heir according to the contested will, did not move into the big house or claim a grand bedroom. She continued to live behind the kitchen, continued to manage the household so that people ate and fires were stoked and laundry was done. The routine of Belmont limped along, a wounded animal still breathing out of habit. But under that surface, loyalties were being tested. Some of the enslaved workers sympathized with Margaret, not because they loved her, but because they feared the chaos that would come if the white world decided to punish everyone for Robert's choices. Others looked at Eliza and silently saw in her a possibility that terrified and thrilled them. Someone who had been what they were and now stood on the edge of being something the law barely recognized the legal battle had only just begun. The plantation, the town, and soon the entire region were about to be forced to look at themselves in a mirror they had spent decades avoiding. For the white families of Natchez, the case of Robert Thornton's will would become a kind of nightmare, not because it introduced something new, but because it refused to let them pretend that the old, familiar contradictions of their world could stay buried by the end of that first stunned week. Natchez had already transformed the Thornton scandal from a family tragedy into a public obsession. In parlors along Pearl Street, in smoke-filled taverns near the riverfront, in church vestibules where whispers carried farther than hymns, people spoke of nothing else. Not the cotton market, not the railroad expansion, not the governor's latest speech, only the will that had reordered the hierarchy of one of Mississippi's most prestigious families. The city had seen affairs, duels, bankruptcies, and shootings. But nothing like this. A plantation master leaving his fortune to a woman he had owned. And to the children everyone knew existed but had agreed never to see. The scandal didn't just ripple. It split the entire city into neat, vicious factions, not the Thornton loyalists. On one side were the old planter families, those who saw themselves reflected in Margaret's suffering. They gathered in drawing rooms beneath oil portraits of their ancestors and insisted that the will was impossible, illegitimate, immoral. They claimed Robert had been manipulated by a scheming woman, and that if the courts validated such a will, the entire South would be thrown into chaos. Because beneath all the righteous indignation lay a deeper fear. If Robert Thornton could do this, what would stop other men from freeing their mixed-race children next? It was fear of precedent, not morality. That made the old families circle their wagons. The quiet sympathizers on the opposite side, though far smaller and far less vocal, stood. A handful of abolition-sympathetic merchants, Quaker families, itinerant ministers, and a few businessmen who believed that property rights were absolute. A man could give what he owned to whomever he pleased. Privately, some admitted they admired Robert's attempt to right a monstrous wrong, but they were careful. Too much public support for Eliza could ruin a man's business or endanger his family. Morals only stretched so far when livelihoods were at stake, the watchers. And then there was the majority, the large, restless middle, who watched the unfolding disaster with horrified fascination. They whispered about the scandal while pretending to condemn it. They speculated wildly. How long had the affair lasted? How many knew? Were there other children? Was this truly love or merely guilt dressed in sentiment? The scandal had become entertainment, and the people of Natchez devoured it greedily. Their fascination had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with what the will forced them to face. The hypocrisy built into their society. Every plantation had secrets. Every respectable house had contradictions tucked between floorboards. The Thornton case reminded everyone how thin the line was between order and collapse. Eliza discovers just how alone she is. Eliza tried, at first, to maintain normalcy. She woke early, dressed the children, kept household routines moving. But by the end of June, she understood something she had not fully grasped. Freedom on paper did not create freedom in daily life. 3 days after the will reading, she walked into Henderson's general store to purchase fabric, lamp oil, and sugar supplies she had routinely ordered for years on Margaret's behalf. Henderson, a stout man with thinning hair and apologetic eyes, looked at her list, then at her face, and seemed to shrink into himself. "Miss Eliza," he said, almost whispering, "I can't extend credit on the Belmont account." "The account is in Mr. Thornton's will," she said calmly. "Nothing has been decided yet." He swallowed, eyes darting toward the white customers behind her. Mrs. Margaret Thornton closed the account last week. Eliza's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. And even if she hadn't, Henderson's voice dropped to a low, miserable murmur. "I can't sell to you. I'm sorry. Truly I am. But customers have said they won't come here if I support what's happening." "What's happening?" As if she had orchestrated any of it, Eliza thanked him quietly and left at the next door. The owner simply shook his head. At the third, he refused to even meet her eyes. The message was clear. Natchez society had shut its doors to her. That night, as she lit the lamp in her small room, a knock came. She opened the door to find 3 free women of color, who lived in the small free black quarter near the riverfront. Women Eliza had spoken to only in passing over the years. They stepped inside, closing the door behind them. Joanna Price, the eldest, spoke for them all. "We heard what happened in town today. You're going to need help." Eliza blinked. "Why would you help me?" Joanna's expression softened, but her voice held steel. "Because whether you ask for it or not, you're fighting a battle for all of us. If you lose, they'll use your failure to say every free person of color is incapable. That we don't deserve rights. That we cannot own property, cannot run businesses, cannot exist without white guardians. Your victory helps us all. Your loss hurts us all. So yes," she said, "we will help you." Behind Joanna, the other women nodded. Eliza felt something inside her loosen, a tension she hadn't known she was carrying. The support wasn't loud, wasn't public, wasn't safe, but it was real. And it was more than she'd expected. The courtroom becomes a public spectacle. The first preliminary hearing was set for August 1854. By sunrise on the hearing day. crowds swarmed the courthouse like it was a carnival. Men in linen suits, women with parasols, journalists scribbling notes, gossip mongers eager to witness every detailed dot inside. The courtroom was packed so densely that people stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles. This wasn't simply a legal proceeding, it was entertainment, scandal, moral theater. Margaret entered first, dressed in deep black mourning silk, her children arranged around her like somber chess pieces. She looked fragile, devastated, exactly how society believed a wronged wife should look. Just across the aisle, Eliza sat beside Whitfield, wearing the plainest gray dress she owned. Her hair pulled back tightly, no jewelry, no adornment, humility as a defensive weapon. She understood the expectations placed on her, deferential, soft-spoken, dignified but never proud. The room held its breath when both women settled into their seats. Two women who had lived under the same roof for 11 years. Two women whose lives had been intertwined through the choices of one man. Two women who could never again pretend they did not see each other. Thomas Thornton's opening strike. Thomas Thornton rose, adjusted his jacket, and began with a speech polished to perfection. "Your Honor," he declared, "this case is not merely about a will. It is about the stability of our society. The question before us is whether the sanctity of marriage, the rights of legitimate heirs, and the moral order of Mississippi can be overturned by the manipulations of a single enslaved woman." Gasps rippled through the room. Eliza stared straight ahead. She had known this would come. Thomas continued, voice rising. "My brother was in the grip of illness. He was vulnerable. He was compromised. And he was influenced by a woman who used her position to gain unnatural leverage over him." He turned, pointing just subtly toward Eliza. "She bore his children. She used those children to pull him away from his rightful family. And now she seeks to profit from her own wrongdoing." Whitfield rose calmly. His voice did not rise, but the quietness somehow cut sharper than any accusation. "Your Honor, the issue is simple. Did Robert Thornton have the legal right to dispose of his property?" "Yes." "Was he of sound mind?" "Yes." "Did he dictate the will voluntarily, without coercion?" "Yes. We will show that truth, not manipulation, guided him." Judge Foster, expression unreadable, raised a hand. "This matter is far too complex for summary dismissal," he ruled. "We will proceed to full probate in October." A murmur swept the courtroom. Eliza had survived the first blow, but the war had only begun. Margaret's final words to Eliza as the crowd dispersed. Margaret and Eliza passed each other in the aisle. They did not touch. They barely breathed. But Margaret leaned in, her voice so low only Eliza could hear. "You think you have won something?" she whispered, venom soft as silk. "But all you have done is expose yourself. By the time we are done, everyone will know what you are, and you will wish you had taken the dollar and disappeared." Eliza met her gaze, calm and steady. "When this is over," she replied, "your children will still have their name, their place, their safety. Mine will have their freedom. I will take that trade." It was the last time they ever spoke directly. The next phase would not involve words. It would involve destruction of reputations, of secrets, of illusions. And as October approached, Natchez prepared itself, because the real trial had not even begun. By October 1854, the Thornton case had swollen into something larger than any courtroom, larger even than Natchez itself. The city buzzed with a feverish energy, a mixture of dread and fascination, as if everyone sensed that what was about to unfold would not just decide an inheritance. It would expose truths the entire South had spent generations burying. Before dawn the first morning of the full probate hearing, crowds gathered on the courthouse steps, planters in pressed linen suits, merchants hoping for gossip to trade, housewives clutching parasols, reporters scribbling eager notes. Everyone wanted to witness the spectacle. Everyone wanted to watch two women, one white, one black, fight for ownership of a world that had been built on lies neither of them had chosen. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. Spectators crammed into every inch of space, lining the aisles, packing the doorway, pressing against the windows. On one side of the aisle sat Margaret Thornton in full morning attire, her black silk dress and thin veil creating an image of pure, dignified suffering. She looked fragile enough to break under the weight of her grief. She looked like a woman wronged, a wife betrayed, a mother fighting for her children's future, and she knew exactly how powerful that image was. On the other side sat Eliza Marie, her plain gray dress stark against the polished wood benches. There were no jewels, no silk, nothing to soften her presence. She had chosen humility as armor, understanding that a single misinterpreted gesture could confirm every prejudice the white townspeople already held against her. She sat straight back beside Whitfield, hands folded in her lap, composed even as dozens of hostile eyes tried to strip her humanity away. Thomas Thornton began the proceedings with the confidence of a man who believed the courtroom itself belonged to him. When he called Margaret to the stand, the room collectively inhaled. Margaret moved with slow deliberation, each step tremulous, each gesture controlled. She settled into the witness chair with the poise of a woman who knew she was expected to suffer publicly and had prepared to do so. When Thomas asked her how long she had been married to Robert, her voice trembled the way a seasoned actress's might. 23 years, she said softly, and you could feel the sympathy ripple through the spectators. When he asked her whether she had fulfilled her duties as a wife, she answered that she had borne his children, run his household, supported him in all things. And then came the question Thomas had been leading her toward, and did he stand by you? Margaret paused just long enough for the silence to deepen, then whispered, no, he did not. She spoke of discovering Robert's betrayal after Marcus was born. She described seeing the baby, recognizing her husband in the infant's features, and enduring humiliation while maintaining the appearance of propriety. She spoke of years trying to preserve the dignity of her family as her husband's indiscretion lived under the same roof. Her tears fell at the perfect moments, her voice cracked where it should, her hands trembled in just the right way. She was the portrait of a wronged woman, and the jury 12 white men leaned forward with soft hearts and hardened biases. They saw a wife protecting the sanctity of marriage. They saw a mother betrayed. They saw a white woman fighting for her family against a black woman who had, in their eyes, overstepped. Whitfield rose slowly for the cross-examination. He knew the danger in appearing too aggressive. The room was already leaning toward Margaret, their sympathies aligned with the image she had crafted. So he approached quietly, with measured calm. Mrs. Thornton, he began, you said you discovered the relationship between your husband and Miss Eliza in 1845. When you confronted him, what did he say? Margaret hesitated, caught between truth and the version of truth she wanted the court to believe. He said, it was none of my concern, she answered. Whitfield nodded. Did he ever promise to end the relationship? She shook her head. Did he apologize? Again, she shook her head. In fact, Whitfield continued, did he not tell you explicitly that he would continue and that you would have to accept it? Margaret's jaw tightened. Yes, she said. Her voice was quieter now, flatter. The jury shifted uneasily. Whitfield pressed on gently. And you did accept it. For 13 years, you remained in the marriage. You continued to benefit from the plantation's wealth. You attended social events with your husband. You presented to the world that all was well. Margaret stiffened. I had no choice. Whitfield's voice softened. You had the same choice as Miss Eliza had, Mrs. Thornton. The difference is that you could have left. She could not. You chose to stay because the social and financial benefits outweighed the humiliation. She stayed because she was property. The words fell softly but struck like a blow. Thomas immediately shouted an objection. The judge sustained it, but the point had been made. For a brief moment, the courtroom saw the structure beneath the emotions. The difference between choosing to remain silent and being forced into it. But sympathy has momentum, and the room flowed back toward Margaret. Carried by their shared worldview over the next several days, the courtroom became a crucible. Servant after servant testified, some carefully neutral, some bitter, some unexpectedly loyal to Eliza. They described how she managed the accounts, supervised the household, and held a position unusual for someone enslaved. Thomas twisted each fact into an accusation. Proof, he claimed, that Eliza wielded inappropriate influence, that she had weaponized her intelligence to seduce her way into power. But Whitfield's cross-examinations revealed a different truth. Most of the servants respected Eliza. Some admired her. Many acknowledged ways she had protected them from harsher overseers. Each testimony, despite Thomas's best efforts, painted her not as a manipulator, but as a woman who had survived the impossible with grace, but nothing prepared the courtroom for Aunt Ruth, elderly, unflinching, nearly immune to intimidation. She answered Thomas's questions with the precision of someone who had watched white men lie her entire life. When Thomas suggested Eliza had manipulated Robert, Aunt Ruth stared straight at him and said, "Mr. Thomas, how's a woman whose property going to manipulate the man who owns her?" The courtroom erupted, half gasps, half muffled outrage before Judge Foster banged his gavel for silence. Aunt Ruth continued calmly. She bore his children because he came to her room and she couldn't say no. That ain't manipulation. That's what happens when you own a person. The words struck Thomas like a slap. He recovered quickly, but he dismissed her early, knowing the damage had been done. The most devastating witness, however, was Dr. Morrison, the family physician. Thomas needed him to claim Robert had been mentally compromised. He had coached him, prepared him, shaped his testimony, and at first Morrison complied, speaking of fever, delirium, and exhaustion. But under Whitfield's quiet questioning, the truth cracked through. Morrison admitted that he had never observed Robert confused, that he had remained rational, lucid, and fully aware of his decisions almost until the day he died. The jury shifted again. Thomas's argument of insanity wavered, but all of this, the tears, the accusations, the defenses was only prelude, because the moment Whitfield took the stand and read Robert's own words aloud, the courtroom changed. The mask of respectability was ripped away. Every secret Robert had whispered into his attorneys. Hands became public truth. Robert's letter did not describe manipulation. It described guilt. It described shame. It described the painful clarity of a dying man facing the consequences of choices he had spent his life hiding. When Whitfield read, "I free Eliza not as charity, but as an acknowledgement of theft," the room went still. When he read, "I stole her life, her autonomy, her children's childhood," even the jurors shifted uncomfortably. When he read, "I would rather die honest than live one more day lying to myself," Margaret closed her eyes and clenched her jaw so tight the muscles trembled. God, it was the most brutal confession the courtroom had ever heard, not of weakness, but of truth, and it became clear to everyone that the will was not the act of a confused old man. It was the act of a man finally seeing himself clearly for a brief, electric moment. The courtroom teetered, not toward Eliza's victory, not toward Margaret's, but toward something far more dangerous, an uncomfortable truth about the world they all lived in. When the judge finally called for recess, people filed out of the courtroom whispering frantically, some shaken, some furious, some whispering that Robert Thornton had confessed to being the very thing the South insisted no white man could be guilty. And as Eliza walked out into the hot October air, she knew something with absolute clarity. The trial was no longer about proving the will. It was about proving whether the truth could survive in a world built entirely on lies. Days after Whitfield read Robert Thornton's letter in open court were unlike anything Natchez had ever seen. The revelation had ripped through the city like a lightning strike, sudden, blinding, impossible to ignore. Everywhere people gathered, the conversation returned to the same subject, the will, the mistress, the children, the confession. The truth had been spoken out loud in a courtroom full of witnesses, and once spoken, it couldn't be buried again. But instead of producing clarity, it only deepened the confusion. People didn't know whether to be outraged, disgusted, sympathetic, or terrified. Most settled on some combination of all four at Belmont Manor. The tension became a living thing, a presence in the air, vibrating in the walls, humming beneath every word spoken. The house itself felt like it was holding its breath. Margaret and her children occupied the main rooms of the south wing, refusing to yield even a single inch of territory. In the north part of the house, Eliza moved quietly, deliberately, with the awareness that she was living in a space where half the people believed she didn't belong and the other half were waiting to see if she would survive long enough to inherit anything at all. The enslaved workers found themselves caught in a confusion more painful than anything the law could define. They didn't know who they were supposed to obey, or who truly owned them, or what their lives would look like at the end of the trial. Their futures hung in the balance with every legal argument and every witness who took the stand. This uncertainty created a strange kind of silence within the plantation. Conversations that once happened freely in the slave quarters now stopped abruptly when someone approached. Work was performed carefully, cautiously, not out of obedience, but out of fear that any misstep would be interpreted as loyalty to the wrong person. A field hand named Samuel later recalled that those weeks were the most frightening of his life. "We didn't know who should pray for Miss Eliza or pray against her," he said years later. "And if she won, maybe she'd free us all someday. Or maybe the white folks would kill us before she got the chance. If she lost, we'd be sold off like hogs." Either way, we were trapped. Freedom and captivity blurred into one indistinguishable shape. And the people living under Belmont's roof could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. In town, the trial became a kind of public addiction. People waited outside the courthouse each morning just to see who would testify next. Newspapers printed speculations as fact, gossip as evidence, rumor as truth. Some wrote that Eliza had bewitched Robert with spells. Others claimed she was secretly educated in ways that made her dangerous. Very few wrote that the will was simply justice. But most framed the case as a warning. If a woman like Eliza could inherit a plantation, the entire social order might collapse. The fear wasn't about one will. It was about the possibility that other men might follow Robert's example. That the children who moved quietly through plantation kitchens and cotton fields, carrying the features of their white fathers, might someday be recognized as heirs instead of secrets. The idea terrified people more than the scandal itself. The courtroom sessions grew more vicious as the trial moved into its next phase. Thomas Thornton escalated his attacks, calling witnesses who claimed Eliza held too much influence in the household, suggesting she had used her literacy to manipulate Robert's accounts, implying she was ungrateful, immoral, ambitious beyond her station. Whitfield countered with calm precision, forcing witnesses to admit under oath that Robert had always acted of his own free will, that he had openly sought Eliza's guidance in business matters long before any illness could have impaired his mind, that the children were undeniably his not just by rumor, but by resemblance so strong it bordered on undeniable evidence, but none of these testimonies hit the courtroom as forcefully as the moment Whitfield introduced Robert's personal journal entries into the record. Written in Robert's own hand, these entries revealed a man tormented not by love alone, but by a profound moral crisis. He described waking in the middle of the night, unable to breathe from the weight of his guilt. He wrote about overhearing Margaret crying behind a closed door, and feeling the shame of causing pain to a woman who had done nothing but fulfill the role society assigned to her. He wrote about the terror he felt when looking at his own children born into bondage, knowing he had created a life where his sons and daughter were legally less than human. And most devastatingly, he wrote about realizing that the world he had helped build was one he no longer believed in, but from which he had benefited all his life. These entries shook the courtroom. They were too honest, too raw, too precise for Thomas to twist into manipulation or delirium. Robert had known exactly what he was doing, and that truth frightened everyone. Because if Robert Thornton, a respectable planter, a church-going man, a pillar of Natchez society, had seen slavery for the moral rot it was, then what did that imply about the rest of them? What did it imply about the world they had constructed and defended? The jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The spectators whispered. The illusion that only abolitionists questioned slavery began to crumble under the weight of Robert's own recorded words. Throughout this brutal examination of her life, Eliza remained composed. She did not cry, did not raise her voice, did not challenge anyone in anger. She answered questions quietly, with dignity, refusing to let the courtroom turn her into the caricature Thomas tried to paint. But each night, when she returned to her small room behind the kitchen, the strain broke through. She would sit in the dark while her children slept, her hands shaking from exhaustion and fear. She thought about the people in the courtroom calling her a seductress, a manipulator, a destroyer of families. She thought about the men who looked at her as if she had cursed their way of life simply by existing. She thought about the women who glared at her with hatred, as if Eliza had written the rules of the world and not merely survived them. And she wondered how she could protect her children from a society that saw them as threats simply for having been born. Marcus began asking questions she couldn't answer. Why do they hate you? He whispered one night. Why do they hate me? Eliza held him close, but said nothing. How could she explain that the hatred was older than all of them? That it was built into the laws and customs of the land they lived on? That it had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the fear of what his existence represented? As the courtroom battles intensified, one truth emerged clearly. This case was no longer just about the will. It was about whether Mississippi law could contain the contradictions that slavery had created. It was about whether a black woman could ever be seen as more than property. It was about whether the South could tolerate even a single crack in the system that sustained its wealth and its identity. And everyone, Margaret, Eliza, the Thornton children, the enslaved workers, the judges, the spectators, even the jurors knew that whatever the court decided would echo far beyond. Belmont Manor, it wasn't just a trial now, it was a reckoning. And the people of Natchez felt the tremor of it beneath their feet, 30 days after the final arguments. The courtroom filled again as Judge Foster entered with a face that showed he'd spent many sleepless nights. Everyone held their breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy and cautious. He ruled that Robert Thornton had been of sound mind and that the will itself was valid. But he also said Mississippi law would not allow a freed woman of color to inherit an entire plantation of 3,100 acres. So he delivered a compromise. Eliza would receive her freedom, her children's freedom, $50,000, and 800 acres from the north side of Belmont. The rest of the property, businesses, and wealth would return to Margaret and the legitimate children. The courtroom exploded into noise, some outraged. Margaret cried in relief. Eliza stayed perfectly still, not celebrating, not furious, just accepting the half-victory that secured her children's futures. Whitfield asked if she wanted to appeal. She shook her head. The fight was over. In the months that followed. The two halves of Belmont separated like a wound splitting open. Eliza moved into the smaller northern house with Marcus, Sarah, and Thomas. For the first time in their lives, the children slept in rooms that belonged to them. But freedom came with loneliness. No school would accept them. No white merchant would sell to them. And they lived in a strange middle space where they were neither welcomed by whites nor fully trusted by the free black community. Meanwhile, Margaret and her children tried to rebuild their lives on the South Track. They were bitter, exhausted, and forever resentful of what they believed Eliza had taken from them. Years passed. The Civil War came. The enslaved workers on Margaret's land fled to Union lines. Marcus joined the Union Army. When he returned after the war, a grown man in uniform, he passed Margaret on the road. They exchanged stiff nods. They had no words left for each other, only the heavy history between them. Eliza lived long enough to see her children grow into educated, determined adults. Marcus became a teacher. Sarah married a minister in Philadelphia. And Thomas became one of the first black attorneys in Ohio. When Eliza died in 1889, her children found a box filled with Robert's letters, confessions he had never spoken aloud. In them, he admitted he had enslaved the woman he loved, fathered children he kept in bondage, and only tried to make amends when death forced honesty upon him. The letters revealed the truth the courts never fully confronted. His final act wasn't redemption, it was guilt. Belmont's North Tract stayed in Eliza's family for generations, a symbol of a freedom that came too late to heal what had been broken. The South Tract collapsed and was eventually sold off, its legacy fading into dust. In the end, both families carried scars. Both lived with the consequences of choices they never made. And history rarely remembers them, not because the story was small, but because it exposed a truth too large and too uncomfortable for its time.